Catholic faith to follow the Longhouse Religion, as it's called, a form of traditional native spiritual practice. There's been considerable tension, in fact, between the native people and the priests, including lengthy lawsuits over land and other properties. When I first went to the church, where I had reason to believe that old records were stored, I was summarily turned away at the door. I think the priest suspected me of being a lawyer in historian's disguise, come to advance a legal claim on behalf of the other side. Fortunately, I found an elderly priest back in Montreal who was a history buff and knew about my previous work, and he took me back there and reintroduced me and vouched for me, and after that I was welcome to come and go as I pleased. In fact, the priest would hug me and feed me and encourage my research whenever I arrived. Another of the village sites was the Indian Cultural Center. This was a kind of opposite number to the church. Its whole purpose was to put Indian interests and Indian traditions out front. There, too, I was at first received with wariness, but eventually with much warmth and encouragement. Going from one place to the other, which I had to do many times, sort of back and forth, it always felt somewhat awkward, but I actually was intrigued by the differences, which could, in a way, serve to animate my story. I want to say a bit more about that village and its people. They're a remarkably interesting group. They've been unusually, perhaps uniquely adept at making their way in the white people's world. In Eunice's day, they were extremely enterprising traders, carrying furs in huge quantity from farther north, down the rivers and lakes to Albany, and sometimes all the way to New York City. This meant they're doing business with English merchants, which was wholly against French colonial law, and which made French officials fume with a kind of impotent rage. 100 years later, that takes it into the early 19th century, when the fur trade was gone or removed far to the west, the Ganawagi became boatmen up and down the St. Lawrence and adjacent riverways. They were so good at this that supposedly they alone could navigate the treacherous rapids that barred the way on either side of Montreal. In the late 19th century, they turned to theater and traveled the world doing Indian shows, so-called. They went all over the US and Europe, and I think even farther afield. In the early 20th century, they became famous as high steel workers. They helped build the Brooklyn Bridge and various New York skyscrapers and other structures in other cities as well. It was said that they were suited to this work because of having extraordinary balance and also because they were incapable of feeling fear. I think that last idea expressed a sort of backhand racism, as if such primitive folk didn't know better than to be afraid. When I discussed this once with a retired high steel worker in the village, he said, "We felt fear all right. We just knew how to handle it better than the white folks." Nowadays, they do quite well, selling cut-rate cigarettes and booze out of the village to whomever comes along. Their First Nation, so-called First Nation status, gives them some kind of exemption from Canadian tax laws. But there also are ongoing difficulties about that, which I haven't tried to understand. Anyway, as I say, remarkable people holding themselves very distinct from the cultural world around them, but much involved in the economic world, where they've stood ever ready to see and seize the main chance. Their ancestors were Eunice's people, and they include today some of her direct descendants. Deerfield and Ganawagi were my two most important research sites, but not the only ones. I made a week-long trip to the Archives of Canada in Ottawa. It's a truly amazing place, or at least it was when I was there, because it was open around the clock, 24 hours without a break. For some reason, the prospect of working nonstop through the night greatly excited me. I'd never been to a research archive where that was possible before. In the first day, I stayed in the archives till I think it was around 5 a.m. on the next day. Then I crashed and had to go to bed till supper time. And after that, I tried to keep more regular hours. I went also to the Pennsylvania Historical Society and the New York Historical Society, at both of which I uncovered at least some modest tracts of Eunice. And I went quite a few other places too. I even got to Paris and visited the French Jesuit archives there. Found nothing, totally dry well. I sent a letter of inquiry to the biggest of all the many different Jesuit archives, the one in Rome, but got no response, so I didn't bother with it further. By now I had enough material for the book I envisioned. Still, the possibility of additional documents gnawed at me. I was convinced, indeed I still am at least half convinced, that somewhere buried in one or another of those many archives lies a manuscript entitled approximately The Life of Eyangote, a.k.a. Eunice Williams, as told to Father Lafiteau or some other mission priest. Surely the priests understood that she was special and worthy of close attention. So why wouldn't they have written her story down? Anyway, if it's out there, someone else will have to find it. Time at last to write the book. The research had taken about 6 years. I was very much looking forward to this part, the writing part, more so than had been the case with any of my previous projects. In choosing to do narrative, I fully expected to give the whole aspect of prose composition top priority. Historians always profess to value good writing, but mostly what they mean by that is effective communication, getting your point across with clarity and force, and maybe at least a modicum of grace. But that's not what real writers have in mind. Novelists and authors of what is sometimes called creative nonfiction aim for a great deal more. They aim for the heart as well as the head. They wish to foster emotional alongside cognitive response. And to achieve this kind of result, they deploy a wide variety of prose techniques in terms of pacing, pitch, tone, point of view, metaphor, simile, etc., not to mention the shaping and nuance of artful plotting. I'm saying the obvious here, but most historians, even the best of the good writers among them, don't ordinarily think in such terms. And I too had, up to this point in my own writing, settled for a goal of effective communication. Then, with a captive project in view, I decided quite self-consciously to try for something more. For many years, I had made a point of searching out good historical fiction and had come away awfully impressed with what is sometimes achieved there. I could mention some examples. Well, I cut my teeth, professionally speaking, by studying or writing about the history of family life, and Wallace Stegner's novel, Angle of Repose. I don't know if you know it. It was from the 70s, actually. When I finally read it, it seemed a finer, deeper evocation of family history than any scholarly work I could think of, and there were others as well. So, in general, I kind of took some historical fiction writers, like Stegner and others, as kind of my inspiration. I borrowed from them shamelessly in this captive book, shifting authorial voice, using sentence fragments quite liberally to kind of speed up the pace, scrounging my brain and my experience too for sharp imagery, and even at a few points composing quite imaginary scenes. One such move where I jumped into Eunice Williams's head and tried to imagine why she had so utterly rejected the idea of returning to New England, that became a kind of signature passage for the book as a whole. Again and again, it would turn up in the reviews. I have to say that responses to this made-up passage were decidedly mixed. One very eminent scholar in his review of the book praised just about every other aspect of it, but said that historians should never, ever make things up. Anyway, I loved the process of trying for this more literary mode of writing, and I didn't mind when some readers and reviewers called my book, quote, novelistic. Indeed, I was especially pleased when several of the reviews actually came from excellent novelists, Hilary Mantel, Barry Unsworth, Jonathan Alter, and others whom I had long admired. I'll say just a few words also about matters of production. I mean the book as an object. My publisher, Alfred Knopf Incorporated, made it into the most beautiful thing that has ever carried my name. I was and am enormously grateful for that. My editor at Knopf, Ashbel Green, wasn't entirely happy with my literary aspirations. We wrangled about some of that, but in the end, he let me have my way. And then there was the book jacket. When Ash Green asked me about what visuals there might be from the period that would be suitable for a jacket, pictures, whatever, I said, can't think of a single thing. So he said he would ask a young artist that they had worked with in the past to create some kind of cover image based presumably on the story. I was nervous about that. Who knew what might turn up? Then after a couple of months came a photograph of the painting they had commissioned, and I was blown away. Its creator was Walton Ford, who was indeed at that point a kind of a struggling young artist and not very well known. Since then, he's become highly celebrated and famous with a large and wonderful show several years ago at the Brooklyn Museum, a long New Yorker essay about him, and so on. I worried, in fact, about a review that might begin, the best thing about this book is its cover. But mainly, as with the rest of the production, I felt very fortunate and grateful to Mr. Ford. And here, indeed, is the painting he made, which we were able to purchase from him after the book came out. It hangs over my desk today, and I love to look at it every morning when I go to my study.
Particularly on a warm day.
Yeah. Okay, enough of these process details. I do want, before winding up, to try to offer something a little broader and deeper, something that would connect my book with doing history in a more general sense. And for that, I'm going to return to the journey aspect and take you through some twists and turns that go all the way back to my professional beginnings. The question I'd like to put up front here is, what does a historian's life have to do with his or her work? If asked that question, say 40 years ago when I was just starting out, I would, I think, pretty much have dismissed it. Historians, it would then have seemed clear, are preeminently concerned with other people's lives. In my own case, with lives that began and ended 2 or 3 or even 4 centuries ago. In fact, I thought it was my job as a scholar to hold myself apart from the subject, lest the dreaded contamination of personal bias affect my results. I know that this last sentence sort of oversimplifies a very old debate about the issue of historical objectivity, but something like it is a lesson that I do remember learning in my courses about historical method as far back as college. Well, if that was the lesson of my early years, I think that in all the years since, I've been gradually, though not always consciously, unlearning it. Actually, I think that at some level, I never fully accepted it and wanted to unlearn it, though I would not for quite a while have admitted as much. There is, after all, a certain grandeur in the scholar's traditional pose of self-suppression. That noble dream, as another historian has put it, truth outside the self, truth above the self, truth for its own sake, irrespective of the self. On the other hand, as a little voice began increasingly to whisper inside me, one might well wonder about the wisdom of investing a whole career in an activity that must be so carefully walled off from all one's personal experience. My students, by the way, at least my undergraduate students, seem to fall into similar viewpoints even before they arrive in a college classroom. If asked to describe their sense of history as a subject, their favorite modifier seems to be dry, and it's not a compliment. You press them to explain dry, and they will typically say in one way or another that history has little to do with life, their own life, or for that matter, life in general. Well, that remained the sort of the nub of my historian's conundrum for a very long time. Let me say a bit more about my struggle, my process of unlearning the old work apart from life lesson. Actually, the process began, at least to a small degree, with my first published book. That was my family history project, to which I referred a moment ago. And in studying family history, I could not avoid some flashes of comparison to the families of which I have been personally a part. For instance, I wrote in that book about the patterns in 17th century New England Puritan families around raising young children. I had myself a 2-year-old daughter underfoot, sometimes literally underfoot, as I wrote. And she made a difference in the way I saw and understood Puritan child rearing. There was a long footnote in which I admitted the connection. One sympathetic reviewer referred to it as the Allison footnote, unquote. Was this kind of thing a breach in the traditional boundary between scholar and subject, between self and history? I reasoned, or at least I rationalized, that I was using my personal experience very selectively as an aid to understanding the life of the past. Carefully controlled use, judiciously framed application, and I also assured myself scrupulous self-examination to make certain that I wasn't simply projecting my present and personal concerns out where they didn't belong. That was the gist of my rationalization. Then came another book. Well, this was the one about witchcraft history, and I found myself doing similar things. I'll mention just one example now. There was a part of the witchcraft record, a big part in the eyes of the participants themselves, that it seemed I couldn't, at least initially, understand. It was the whole illusory dimension, the spectral shapes that people saw flying across a room, the strange, terrifying, seemingly inexplicable noises they said they heard, the wildly improbable human and animal behaviors they reported, neighbors who came and vanished in a trice, cows that suddenly went dancing, as they said, corpses that suddenly shed fresh blood, all the really spooky stuff in the witchcraft cases. Well, I couldn't understand it. Not, that is, until a summer afternoon on a mountaineering trip in the Pacific Northwest, when I found myself dangling 15 feet down inside a deep crevasse on a very broad glacier on a very high mountain peak. While I dangled in the crevasse, I made a big mistake. I looked down into the depths of an immense and terrifying blackness. Seeking reassurance, I glanced anxiously at my climbing rope, which had been knotted around my waist to hold me up, and saw that the knot that I had tied moments before seemed to be pulling apart. I thought I had about 5 seconds left to live, and I screamed for help. Our climbing guide scurried to the lip of the crevasse above me, peered down at my rope, and said, "Looks fine to me." Indeed, he was right. The knot was fine, and I was fine, although panic-stricken. But even as I tell you this little story right now, in my mind's eye, I can see the rope coming apart. The point is that after this experience, which showed me in the most vivid possible way the power of intense emotion to alter sense perception, what we think we see and hear and so forth and so on, I did understand the spooky parts of the witchcraft record, and I was freed to write about them as I could not have done before. Fast forward now to, once more, to the Unredeemed Captive. By the time I began that project, I was becoming more and more comfortable with the whole idea of using my own experience, my life, in the service of my scholarship and writing. And for sure, I did it again and again throughout my long journey with Eunice. I pondered my own brushes with terror while trying to reimagine the extraordinary terror of the Deerfield Massacre. Were I writing about that event today or recently, I would surely be referencing September 11, 2001. I relived my most acute moments of disappointment while preparing to make the move of jumping into Eunice's head in search of the reasons for her refusal to return. I also recalled my most excited moments as part of reconstructing the feelings around her eventual and hugely exciting visit back to Massachusetts in her later years. I got Virginia to join me in a weekend workshop on snowshoeing in New Hampshire in mid-January. It was 10 below zero, so as to get the feel of woodland travel in wintertime. Anyway, you get the idea. And yet, as I went along, I sensed something more, something different happening this time. Not only was I using myself and my experience for the sake of the project, for its part, was really getting under my skin. There was something in short of a reverse direction. I began to feel emotionally involved with the characters in the story. I've already mentioned my difficulty with Eunice's father, the Reverend John, and my warm identification with her brother Stephen. I had, as a result of all this, many questions to ask myself, but there's no need to go through additional specific details. The larger point, as I can see quite clearly in retrospect, is that the Williams story was taking on a meaning for me and was affecting me, even as, in a sense, I affected it and shaped its meaning. Moreover, that connection, that process of sort of two-way influence, I and the story and me, was infusing the book with whatever emotional energy it would eventually come to have. But for a long time, I couldn't exactly identify the nature of the connection. Then, with the book already in production, I read something that finally made it come clear. This was a beautifully composed and heartbreaking essay in The New Yorker by a writer previously unknown to me named Noel Oxenhandler. The essay was about the kidnapping in California in the summer of 1993 of a 12-year-old girl named Polly Klaas. Possibly some of you may remember this tragic case and may even have seen the New Yorker piece. Anyway, near the end of the piece appeared the following passage. There is something, I'm quoting now, there is something about kidnapping that retains a unique horror. It is, of course, the ultimate horror for parents, for it accomplishes in a single hour a realization that under normal circumstances is the work of years and years, the realization that our children have a fate that is separate from our own. Let me repeat that last line. Our children have a fate that is separate from our own. That's huge. How dare they? So there it was at last, the meaning of my book for sure. In a word, separation. All that's involved in dealing with separation. Every one of us has to confront it. It has many different permutations, but with at bottom a common core. Eunice Williams had been kidnapped, made captive, and her subsequent life as a Mohawk Indian differed totally from that of her Puritan parents. And surely it was no coincidence that my own children had, during the period of my book's creation, launched themselves into adulthood, been captured by the wider world, and begun to live out their own separate fate. In fact, nothing else in those years had stirred me so profoundly. So, what are the feelings as I look back on the journey? Well, I would say, first of all, it was quite wonderful. I can hardly remember a downside moment. Maybe there were a few of those, but if so, I've repressed them. My predominant feeling is simply gratitude. Certainly, I'm grateful to the many people who facilitated the process in all sorts of practical ways: archivists, librarians, travel agents, typists, and others too numerous to mention. I'm grateful as well to several colleagues and friends who, as is usually the case, who read and improved the manuscript with their comments and encouraged me along the way. But most of all, I'm grateful to a few people who were at the center of my personal work-to-life connection. To my daughters, who by enacting separation before my eyes, unknowingly set me up for my encounter with Eunice Williams. To Virginia, who was with me on this part of the journey, as well as many others, including snowshoeing. To Noelle Oxenhandler, who with her New Yorker piece gave me the words for what was finally at stake here. And not least to Eunice Williams herself for doing what she did and being who she was. So the way I think of it, these several special people, past and present, enabled me not only to write and publish a book, but also to see and to struggle with some of life's deepest challenges. And thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon and joining me on this little retrospect of my journey. Thanks very much. I'm glad to take questions and comments if you have any.
Yeah. What was the procedure for returning many of the captives? I mean, they were in the French and Indian War. They would be taken to Canada.
Yeah.
Some came back, but they would
Quite a few came back.
interrelate with French who? The ministry or the officers? I mean, well, and then some came back. Did they escape or did they?
Well, there were a variety of ways, actually.
Was it trade?
But the biggest single way was ransom.
Ransom.
Was paying money for their return.